Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session of the Virtual Journal Club this afternoon. I see that we have a good group, and I want to especially welcome all the diehards of the Journal Club, considering that we have this Memorial Long Weekend coming up, and all of you are here instead of at the beach. I think our presenters should feel very honored, as do I. So today the topic is very interesting. We have Dr. John Parboosingh talking to us about, sorry John, you moved the slides, so I lost the topic, but we are talking about learning from each other and building collective minds, as well as other behaviors exhibited by highly effective clinical teams. So, as always, we'll touch on the theory and be happy to share John's thoughts and knowledge and tap into that, but then also try to put that into our context, of course, and the implications for our field. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Curt, Olson, who's going to facilitate the session and properly introduce Dr. John Parboosingh. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce John to you all. I have known him for several years. He's been very active with the journal, both as a contributor and a reviewer. He is the former Associate Dean of SACME at Calgary and was Director of Professional Development at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He's been a member of SACME since '84. He's held office there, including president, and he is presently Professor Emeritus in Medical Education and Obstetrics at University of Calgary. What I was most interested to learn about John was that in 2000, Dr. Parboosingh completed a foundations course on the topic of communities of practice, and it was led by Etienne Wenger, who of course is half of the duo Lave and Wenger. So very interested to learn that, John, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Curt. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming to the Journal Club, especially at the beginning of this long weekend. My ideas for this session have been influenced by members of a small research group that I have been privileged to be part of for the past 4 years. My colleagues Don Hess, Hank Bernstein, and Alvaro Margolis are present here today. Mary Turco, our past president, is also a member of my research group. The papers for this journal club, shown on my second slide, were selected because they provide a systems perspective on how practitioners who are networked hold conversations and learn from each other, and so doing change their practice over time. These papers provide just a starting point for us to explore how we can align future CME practices with the changes taking place in the healthcare environment today. Now, I'm aware that members of the Society are already working towards this goal. I'm reminded of a quotation from Yogi Berra, who said, "The future is here, it's just very patchy." Well, let's get started. I've numbered the slides so that if someone's just on the telephone, they can actually see the slides that they downloaded. This slide shows the two extremes in management models described in Tony Suchman's paper. On the left is your top-down command and control model with its typical org chart. In this model, management hires external consultants who use traditional classroom methods to help workers to adopt new practices. CME providers have played this role for nearly a century. But many organizations are moving towards the network model, shown on the right of the slide. The org chart is really a network map. In this model, physical space is created and opportunities found for workers to share stories about practice experiences from which emerge visions of a better practice. Workers are encouraged to be creative and come up with improvements in practice which are piloted and evaluated in due course. There is mounting evidence that enhancing conversations and building relationships between practitioners are more successful at achieving sustained improvements in practice than traditional QI methods. These studies are cited in our publications. So what kinds of conversations enable practitioners to create visions of a better practice and motivate change? Some time ago, Etienne Wenger asked me to describe the types of conversations practitioners engage in while at work. My response is shown in the next slide, slide 4. I described three types of conversations. First type occurs while communicating about patients, when, for instance, a doctor and a nurse or receptionist exchange information about a patient. It's usually very brief and to the point. The second type of conversation occurs at education meetings such as grand rounds. Typically, a best practice is presented by an expert. Here the communication is mainly one way and occurs in traditional classroom style. The third type of conversation takes place after the formal meeting when we go for coffee. Here practitioners sit with colleagues with whom they have a trusting relationship. It's a safe environment where they can exchange stories about their practice without feeling threatened. Researchers have found that conversations that take place in this social space change perspectives and motivate practitioners to get engaged and feel ownership of the learning process. Let's look at the next slide. In this slide 5, I compare the two learning scenarios, thinking that we can align future CME practices with things happening in this social space and make CME more effective in improving practice. On the left is the typical grand rounds format with which we are all familiar. On the right we have the social learning space. It's called a space by researchers because it reflects a continuous conversation that takes place between network practitioners who meet informally, for instance for coffee, or at the water cooler during work hours, and who might also meet regularly at more formal sessions. Let's compare 4 features of the learning process in these two scenarios. First, the physical setting. The two are quite different. We are familiar with the classroom style, where learners typically are not expected to interact with each other. In fact, you will remember in high school, if you did interact with each other, that was called cheating. This compares with the informal setting shown on the right of the slide, where practitioners are encouraged to interact as they face each other, eye to eye, in a more comfortable setting. Second feature, who brings the topic for discussion? In traditional CME, the expert brings the topic. In the social learning space, a colleague starts the conversation, often by recalling his or her experience with a patient. This kind of story about a patient has learning opportunities which are quite different from learning opportunities in case reports. The types of conversations are also quite different in the two spaces. Debate about a best practice commonly occurs in CME sessions, and this often leads to a negative discussion, which I call, "We cannot adopt this new practice because" conversation. In other words, they discuss the barriers to adoption. While in the social space, after the first person has told their story, Other practitioners exchange similar practice experiences. Someone might say, whenever I see this, I usually do such and such. That's an example of positive deviance. And someone else might mention a best practice in a research article, which is pulled into the conversation and leads to a how can we do this better conversation. This type of conversation, eloquently described in Peter Senger's text, The Fifth Discipline, now some 20 years old, lays the foundation for what we now call a structured dialogue, to which I will refer later. Finally, I mentioned on the slide that there is limited relationship building between practitioners in the typical CME session, because this has not been considered to be important. So what elements of this social process of learning, called by some socio-cultural learning, can be adapted by CME providers who are charged with the mandate to help practitioners continuously improve their practice? Slide 6 reminds us of some research findings that tell us what issues need to be included in conversations that foster learning and behavior change. Godin and colleagues reviewed some 70 studies reporting on factors that predict healthcare professionals' intentions to change behavior. Godin found that benefits of changing to a new practice, beliefs about capabilities to make the change, and concerns about social influences and professional roles are more powerful variables in predicting behavior change than the practitioner's knowledge of the research evidence supporting the proposed change in practice, which, as you know, is front and center in the traditional CME session. In other words, as practitioners discuss a new practice guideline, for instance, conversations that cover these issues are most likely to impact the future behaviors of the practitioners. Slide 7 starts with a typical CME session in which an expert is presenting a best practice. Let's look at what needs to change if we want to integrate features of sociocultural learning into CME sessions. Our goal is to create a two-way conversation led by a facilitator trained in structured dialogue, as described in Nick Abbey's paper in our reading list. First, we need to change the physical space to the less formal setting that encourages interaction between learners, and achieve what Daniel Kinahan in his text, Thinking Fast and Slow, refers to as creating cognitive ease amongst learners. Next, we need to foster a conversation that covers the issues reported by Godin that influence practitioners' behaviors, and repeated on this slide. Some years ago, I attended a series of conferences called Narrative Matters, at which there were experts in storytelling referring to themselves as dialogue practitioners and talking about the bandwidth of conversations. You see, conversation has become a legitimate pedagogy, which educators can influence. Broadband conversations are conversations that cover the issues that impact learner behavior. I've put this into the form of a fiber optic system to show everybody how the concept of involving these various factors are so important in the conversation. And the easiest and most practical way on introducing these factors is to encourage practitioners to start the conversation with storytelling and pull the evidence in support of the best practice into the conversation as it progresses. John Seeley Brown talks about we have to stop pushing evidence and start pulling it into the conversation of the people who we want to influence. A safe, trusting environment is required for practitioners to recall personal practice experiences. Hence the importance of building trusting relationships between team members in the clinical setting. In the discussion period, we can explore how these features can be built into CME programs. On slide 8, my final slide before it's your turn to talk, I provide 4 questions that might stimulate our discussion. They describe some challenges that we as CME providers need to explore should we want to borrow features from sociocultural learning to make future CME more effective in improving practice. First question, how can we organize CME around people networked by practice rather than around content, as occurs in traditional CME sessions? Next question, how can we enhance the power of existing conversation between practitioners to influence their perspectives and practice behaviors? Third question, can we help create time and space in clinical workplaces where these conversations can unfold? Will the CME Office of the Future provide a service to enhance the learning environment in the clinical setting? And finally, can we use conversation to help foster relationships and build social interaction competence among practitioners? Now, I know these challenges are way beyond the traditional mandate of the CME provider as we see the CME provider today. I'm interested in what Teresa Amabile calls your inner voice as you're listening to these concepts. And your inner voice, as Teresa has pointed out, consists of 3 really components. What is your perspective of what you've heard? What is your very first and frank emotional reaction if you were talking to friends after this session? And did any motivational drive come into your minds while you were listening to this? I'm going to stop here, Curt, and ask you to facilitate the discussion.
Very good. Thank you, John. That was an excellent presentation and concise overview of this topic. All right, so this, I'll be watching for people who are raising hands, sending questions via text or the question box. Just a reminder that you don't need to mute your phones. We can control muting from this end. I see that Alvaro Margulies has his hand up. Alvaro, you are unmuted.
Well, thank you, Curt, and thank you, John. This was a very good presentation, a very clarifying presentation. Just to make a comment and about how can we enhance conversations to influence behavior change. And I know that John put one of the articles we wrote together as a reference. I come from Latin America, and Latin America has 1 million physicians who basically speak 2 languages, Spanish and Portuguese. So we have opportunities to do online CME for large audiences across internationally across Latin America. And in North America, of course, you have English as a main language, also French, but you have similar opportunities to have large audiences. When you have a large audience of hundreds and maybe thousands of healthcare professionals participating in online CME courses, the options for engagement come from the MOOC experience. Interactivity with automated systems like simulators or peer-to-peer exchange with little faculty participation. But what we added based on social network analysis, which is the understanding of network connections, we added another way. We, in the online courses that we implement across the region, we first document the relationships of the registrants, either because they register as a group coming from the same institution, or when we ask them to share their Gmail contacts and cross that information with the attendees. And then we later apply social network analysis and math algorithms to use this information for the educational process. So we finally, to enhance the conversations, as John talked about, we try to produce kind of a faithful experience where participants first see the discussion around themselves with comments from the contacts and also from the faculty, similar to what Facebook does, in the sense that even with a very large audience such as Facebook has, like over 1 billion registrants in Facebook, you see your environment, your close environment around yourself, rather than that audience. So this is a type of interaction online, but also knowing that close tie exists between among people who work in the same institution. Since we register that information, we try to have tasks for those groups of participants coming from those institutions and those workplaces as a way to take it into a specific practice setting what is being learned in a more international and general course. So this is the way we try to enhance conversation using social network analysis. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that contribution. I have a question in the wings, so to speak here, but is there anything that you wanted to say, John, in response to the comments?
No, thank you, Curt, and thanks, Alvaro, for that. I know that I'm very familiar with your work, and indeed, this is a great attempt to actually get people together who know each other and have a similar practice and are not afraid to share their inner voice as they describe their practice experiences. I think in the past, quite often when we've been planning CMEs, we said, well, we want to break up this group. We want to put them in different arenas, and we don't want them all together in one place. Well, it's quite the opposite when you are using conversation as a form of pedagogy. You want people who are prepared to share their experiences and continue a conversation just as if it were at home.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I lost track of my question. Here it is. Jan Baumer wrote in asking, do you have recommendations for how to encourage the transition of faculty presenters from the old school of thought that is top-down to the social learning model? Also, any recommendations for resistance to this change?
Oh, I'm sure there are others, and I would ask Don to respond as well. But just a quickie, Jan, thank you very much for that. I think that the societies we have now, including SACME, should really have a group of people, and they probably do already. I'm not familiar with the conversations going on at the society just now. They should have a group of people who are exploring just that. And I think one way to do that is for us to start workshops on how to facilitate structured dialogue. And then along with that workshop would be a set of tools, and so that if we in the future invited someone to run a workshop, they could go through a very quick online training, if you want to call it that. Not a term that I use, but a mentorship, very quick online mentorship and the use of the tools that can be used to teach someone how to facilitate structured dialogue. That's just off the top of my head, but I think we need to explore these in a group that's looking towards the future.
Very good. I have a question now from Ginny Jacobs. She's saying, I appreciate the fact you highlighted an organic element to the networks and group learning, which often prove to be the most impactful. How would you respond to someone who is critical that any attempt to formalize that structure could in fact disrupt the valuable elements and connections which are driven by self-motivation. This is a question, I think this is really a fascinating question. You know, to what, for example, to what extent can you encourage a community of practice to emerge as opposed to it just sort of happening naturally?
Absolutely, a wonderful question, Jenny. And actually, I've seen the damage done. I've had to sit and watch the damage done by a leader in a department who means very well, who is really loved by his department members, but he wants to lead as opposed to facilitate. And I think the answer is yes, there's a great damage there. And in a workshop on teaching the skills of facilitating structured dialogue, I would put this right up front as a problem. And I think the best facilitator is one who can listen to the conversations and with a background in complex adaptive systems understands how to identify patterns that are happening in the conversation. So I think that the workplace of the future, anyone who is trying to enhance that it does more listening than actions. And actually, I would recommend that the people who are facilitating that be actually a member of the workplace themselves.
Very good. I have a question, this one from the Royal College. Great presentation. Given the structure required by these conversations and the conditions that are needed for them to be successful, does it change the level of trust required for these to be effective? And can we actually reset this?
Anyone else would like to answer this?
Let's see. Oliver Hess, or sorry, Donald Hess has his hands up. Donald, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. John, great job condensing a lot of information into a few slides and getting this conversation going. Yeah, I think it does take a certain amount of skill for anyone to try to facilitate a conversation like this. And let me just share a little bit with how I've have tried to do this and intend to do this going forward. And I think that this may be the transitional format that an earlier question was alluding to between a more traditional didactic grand rounds SACME versus a more informal conversational learning place to discuss things. Anyway, I think it's very important to establish a safe relational space, and so having people in the room who are fairly acquainted with each other certainly will enhance the ability for meaningful conversation to occur. And so what I'm a CME coordinator, and I am responsible for a weekly grand rounds, and I have a pretty dedicated audience of primary care practitioners that I meet with week after week, and so we know each other fairly well. And right now, I've just started a series of traditional didactic presentations on the topic, on the content of diagnostic error, in response to the Institute of Medicine's call for more education in that area. So I'm bringing in some outside presenters to speak on diagnostic error. And after 3 of these sessions, what I intend to do is to have a sense-making conversation session, which I myself will lead. And I'll likely push the podium aside, put an easy chair in front of the room, and let everyone know that we've received all this information about about diagnostic error, how are we going to apply this and put this into practice in our own institution? And I think it will take, as I see this, how do we organize CME around people networked by practice rather than content? This is actually organizing around people and content, the content being diagnostic error, but I'm going to very much try to draw in the radiologists and the pathologists at our institution as well in order to make the results of whatever we discuss in this future session have all the more impact. So, that's what I'd like to share at this.
Well, thanks, Don. Actually, Don has been a core member of our research group for some 4 years now. And just getting back to the idea of the need for trust, I'm very skeptical of many of the research papers talking about practice facilitation, in which someone has come in from the outside and tried to do the job. And especially some of the articles that have been from the VA, in which I know that many of their staff might even be from have a military background. And I think that what we need, if a CME office, say, wanted to contract with the Department of Obstetrics, for instance, they may want to train 1 or 2 individuals in that department, and not necessarily the physicians. In my experience, clinic receptionists and the clinic nurse are great people to train in the skills of structured dialogue, and they have already established a level of trust with the group.
I have an anonymous question here for you, John. The question is, there is a great swell, a social imperative, if you will, for more medical leadership. And quite often those models of leadership don't really focus a great deal on dialogue in the way that we're talking about it. So how do we reconcile with what we're talking about here and what might be done from an educational point of view with a phenomenon like this?
Good question, and one which I've sort of thought about from time to time. I think, and especially as I've been putting this together, I think that if I was an office of CME right now in a say a university, as the members of the society are, I would look for a new leader, young leader coming in to lead a new department. He's just been recruited, and he or she is already talking about, without using the word reform, but starting to rearrange the department. And I would say, well, let's look at let's talk in terms of the members of the department. Members meaning everybody from the receptionists at the clinics right through to the doctors, and let's talk about them as agents, as a complex adaptive system who are interacting with each other. And you don't need a formal network analysis, as Alvera has to do when he's got 1 million doctors, but you can say, just ask the question, who talks to who goes to lunch together? And you start to develop, you start to see a pattern, a network pattern of the natural links actually happening in the department. And I think you start from that point of view, and you start to form and enhance and let people know from the very beginning it's now legitimate for people to talk to each other informally, as this is going to be part of the information flow of this quotes unquote new department. And it's happening right now out there. There's the larger institutions are undergoing what they call reform, but also there's a new type of management model which is called TEAL, T-E-A-L, which you can look up in Google and learn a little bit about. It's about teams are the centerpiece. The middle management is reduced to a minimum. and those teams actually work by talking with each other. And they need dialogue facilitation for sure. So I think it is possible, but I think I would suggest that societies start to get people around a table to say, what would our CME look like in 5 years from now? 5 years may be a bit dangerous, even 3 years from now. What needs to change if we want to respond to what's happening in the healthcare system? And then we can explore these things that we've been talking about in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up question to that, the one you just addressed. Are you familiar with the Epiphany work?
Off the top of my head, no. Could somebody describe that for us?
Unfortunately, I have not heard of this before, so
Neither have I. Is somebody there who would like to tell us?
Let me see. No one is coming forward.
It reminds me, just Curt, off the top of my head, of the Aristotle project has just been published. The Aristotle project is a project run by Google over the last 4 years to identify what are the important ingredients in a team that's been put together to be creative. And I don't know, it sounds very much like the Epiphany, maybe something similar to that. But if anyone's interested in the report from Google, it's been published in a publication. I'm just trying to wake up my e-reader to give you the reference. It's by it's a book called Smarter, Faster, Better by Charles Duhigg, D-U-H-I-G-G, and it describes, amongst other things, the outcome of the Aristotle project by Google about how to create creative teams.
I beg your pardon. I don't know if you heard my or not, but there was the audio temporarily went out. I don't know if that was everyone's experience or just mine, but it sounds like we're back to where we need to be. So, another question. Circling back to the faculty development issue that Jan Baumer raised. This from Jenny Jacobs. It seems there's a dramatic culture shift required to support a facilitated discussion versus didactic presentation format. That new culture must encourage discussion and debate. However, that may be contrary to the type of training we currently provide to in our medical schools. So 2 questions. What suggestions do you have for moving us from a setting which rewards the confident sage on the stage approach and instead moves us to a culture where we encourage conversation and groupthink? And the next question is rather lengthy, so why don't I pause there and we'll come back to the second question.
Yeah, I'd also like others on the call to chip into this, but I think that there have been, what I did some years ago, and it's gone from my memory, most of it, is reviewed what companies did when they were trying to make transformational change. And the one that comes to me right now is Xerox, which for years and years Xerox made equipment, office equipment. And they suddenly said, well, I think we need to help people to use that office equipment better. So we need to move into the area. We're now in the business of document servicing. We are document managers. And so they then had, and of course many of their workers would say, well, we don't know anything about that. How are we going to get there? And then there are a series of steps that have to take place, which includes dialogue. And there are a number of companies that have done the same too. And there are lots of tips in the workings of different companies of how to introduce dialogue, which is actually happening in the healthcare system right now. There are scrums, use of scrums in intensive care units. In obstetrics in Canada, at the end of every delivery, there's a little session which they call Take 5. which is a dialogue that takes place about that particular delivery, which allows everybody to speak. And also John Seeley Brown reports that even at the production line in Toyota, at the end of a shift, the new shift meets with the old shift for an hour. 1 hour, in which they are encouraged to be critical of that previous shift, and quite often changes are made even before the new shift comes on. So I think that there are things happening out there now that we could learn if we sort of stepped outside our community of CME. I think we could learn a lot about how to achieve these transformational changes, which immediately we look at this and say, how the hell are we going to do this? Well, I think that, you know, I could even use some threatening language and say, if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. I actually believe that for the last century, CME has been driven, doctors have been persuaded to do CME through their specialty societies, and more recently the boards have come along, and of course the licensing authorities have come along. I believe in the future the drive is going to come from the clinics and the healthcare organizations, who are going to be in serious issues if they don't keep up with quality. So I believe we're going to have a different drive towards CME, and I think that societies such as SACME should be starting to talk about this.
Very good. Now, just to paraphrase the follow-up question, which is simply, do you see, looking forward, do you see reasons to be optimistic? Are you seeing signs, for example, that residents are becoming more comfortable with a dialogic approach to learning and more willing to both learn that way and also teach that way?
Again, I hope others can answer this, but yes, I do. I'm very optimistic. I see residents coming together in groups. I see residents actually, I've gotten examples of 3-4 people coming to live together in an apartment, and using that for discussion after lectures. So yes, I do, but I also see this happening in other arenas. There is a Dutch community nursing company, some 3,000 or 4,000 nurses who have taken over the teal management, which is described in a recent text, in which the nurses are in teams of 12 to 15, and they are managing themselves. And in fact, there are no middle managers telling them what to do. They have to sit down and decide themselves what they're going to do. And so, you know, to be politically incorrect, we have to start telling some of the teachers that we need to hand over the asylum to the lunatics.
I just sent out circling back to the mention of Epiphany project, someone provided a reference for that, a URL, and that just went out to everybody. Another question, how is what we're talking about, John, different than quality teams or T groups, for example?
I think they're all coming together. They're all converging. They're all talking about one and the same thing, which is adding credibility to the system, I think, to the need for system change. High-performance teams, some of the things that you've written about, and you've given examples of high-performance teams in healthcare systems and what they do different from other teams. I also, when you talk about transformation change in a company, one of the common features of all these changes in the large companies has been that what they've been doing all along is not being thrown out. It's not, we're not, as your paper says, not throwing out the didactic lectures, like throwing out the baby in the bathwater. In other words, you are, by a closer study of when the client needs that CME presentation, you're actually making a more effective and valuable use of that CME presentation.
Yes, yes. And your very last comment was right on target for a question that I wanted to pose. And that is, the centers around the distinction between education and learning. Now, I usually think of education as being a purposeful attempt by one person to change another, as opposed to learning, which can happen in obviously formal and informal settings and all kinds of different ways. So what I hear much of what you're talking about is about facilitating learning that goes on through dialogue. And sort of in the way of setting up, helping to encourage the formation of communities of practice. Similar thing, facilitating learning. So where, I mean, do you see other ways for education in the way that I defined it also fits into what you're talking about, John?
I think it does. I think that faculty development really needs to start in medical school. It's not faculty development. It's development of professionals who need to talk with patients and talk. I use the word with as opposed to patients. There's a sort of bluffing noise. Is that coming from my microphone?
No, we had someone was unmuted. I just muted them. So.
Oh, okay. No, but I think that we need any professionals who are helping clients, patients in our case, needs to understand the difference between instruction giving and even in information exchange, because you're encouraging the conversation to go beyond in exchanging information and then stimulating people to talk, to be creative. And I think one of the definitions of dialogue is that it's a strategic type of conversation that that allows people to say, well, you know, there may be a better way of doing this. And I know of a paper, I forget the name of the author now, but I can easily find it, in which it starts by saying, you know, the adoption of a practice that has been research divided in a practice guideline is mimicry, and mimicry is the best form of flattery. However, it's not how practice improvement takes place. It's the creativity to improvise like the jazz musicians do, and as you know, there's been a lot of literature on that. What jazz musicians do is very similar to real doctors. And I remember Richard Smith, the editor of the BMJ, past editor of the BMJ. His last, he was a student of mine actually in Edinburgh. His last editorial in the BMJ was called "Doctors Are Not Scientists. They're more like jazz musicians." They improvise around a guideline just as a jazz musician improvises around a piece of music. So I think the answer to your question is, yeah, you know, if you sit and listen, as I've done, gone to the doctor's lounge in a large hospital at 10 o'clock when everybody's having coffee, and listen to, you know, the doctor that says, oh, gee, let me tell you about this patient I had last night. I've never heard the word education in there. I've rarely heard the word learning in there, but there is information and creativity occurring there, which we need somehow to, first of all, legitimize, recognize, and bring it into the fold, which I presume you'd call education.
Mm-hmm. So, an excellent answer. Thank you very much. Well, I am looking to see, oh, we have a comment. This was fantastic signing off from the folks at Royal College. Thank you for that. Opportunity here to get in a question, make a comment. Please step forward if you'd like to do that. You know, you mentioned didactic CME. Now you know that I've argued that there's a place for it. The question is, you know, what is the overall plan? What's the full range of programs and elements that you're putting into play, and what's the contribution that the didactic element needs to make? Is there room for didactic types of teaching and learning within the dialogical model, or is that just antithetical to it?
Great question. I've just reminded me of a story. Justin Locke and myself did a series of conferences, if you want to call them that, in a small rural area in Alberta in Canada, some coming back now 20 years. And we took a cardiologist on one occasion, we always had a cardiologist and a nurse, a specialty nurse, who were the leaders. And this is a totally multidisciplinary session, which there were probably about 20 or 25 people there, family physicians, nurses, etc. It's a structured dialogue. And then suddenly there was silence when the cardiologist brought up, I think it was beta blockers or calcium channel blockers or something like that. And he suddenly picked up on the silence. He said, okay, let's have a 10-minute lecture on calcium channel blockers. So I think the answer is to listen and be prepared to present at the right time. Does that help at all?
It does, it does. What I'm getting is a picture of a dialogue that's taking place, and at important points, the evidence needs to be brought into or new knowledge needs to be brought into the discussion, and that may come through, in your lovely example, a person who is a part of that conversation, or it may be a recognition by the group that, you know, we really need to learn more about this. You know, how can we do that? And so it's really not the modality, and I think you emphasized this very nicely early on, and that is delivering what's needed at the right time.
Yes, it's, you know, if we go back traditionally, needs assessments, you know, done by surveys and things like that, and then 2 years later someone comes and gives the presentation, or the session takes place. And that's because, you know, this person has been in the circuit, and he has to have a year, or she has to have a year's notice before they can come. I think that when you listen to the conversations that are taking place, I wouldn't even call it a need, because again, in that conversation in the doctor's lounge, the word need or gaps don't come up. It's, you know, this is what's bugging me. And somebody else is saying, yeah, no, I would agree, you know, we need to try and find a solution to this. And they're not just wanting to find information that they can just go out and mimic. They want someone to sit around the table and help them create a solution, almost like John Seeley Brown describes as, you know, imagine yourself in a petri dish and you're growing a solution, and the substrate is in fact the evidence we have already that we're working on. And I think that this can be done, because if we have a group of individuals who are meeting regularly in a social learning space, and up comes this topic, which in my estimation it changes literally weekly, then the facilitator can say, okay, let's pull a video in of somebody, or let's pull him into the next meeting, and it doesn't have to be the expert researcher. They want somebody who is closer to their own practice type, who has done this already, a type of positive deviance approach, and who can join, sit in the petri dish with them and grow a solution. I think that that's a different, I did a project which we call the Peak Project at the hospital here not so long ago, in which we had a knowledge broker, and this person found the research evidence for questions that people were raising in practice, and 40% of the questions, there's no real literature that would help them. They need to sit around a table and sort this out themselves, and another 20% of the questions were very straightforward answers, but still needed the sense-making conversation to say how we're going to apply it in our arena, in our context. So I think the answer to your question is really a totally new approach, and let's forget the term needs assessment. It's what's bugging me, so that if we can find someone to come and help us, I'm going to drop what I'm doing and come and listen to this.
Well, I love the analogy of the petri dish. It's very vivid. You had asked me to save a few minutes at the end, John, for closing comments. I see that we're at 4 minutes before the hour, so this is your opportunity to do that.
Well, I think that a number of the things that I've said may sound very provocative, and because and it's not a matter of why we're not doing this now. It's a matter of I think it's the role of a society whose members are in a changing environment and who need to be aware of the changing, and I'm not going to use the word needs, but the changing attitudes and contexts and motivational drives within this changing environment. And I think a society needs to set up some sort of conversation about the future, that some of these issues that I've mentioned today can be either explored or dejected right away. But most of the large organizations, as I've said before, who have done this, the very first, there's some common features of which what they have done in their process of transformational change. The first thing is to study their clients very carefully. And that's where Xerox learned that their clients were not using their office products very well. And so they need to have a method of reaching out into the client space and getting involved and helping the client from that point of view. The second is that the needs of the clients change so rapidly compared with what we have thought the needs have changed in the past, that it's time for us to start finding a new way of meeting those needs. And the organizations that have achieved this so far have used the internet for this, online services to identify their customers and to meet directly with those customers is the way to go. So I'm hoping that the discussion that we've had today will stimulate our three organizations, actually, not just SACME, but ARMY and ACCHPPH, to actually start to think about the future, and GAME as well, because GAME has an issue. How do you provide educational opportunities for people in the front line in Syria right now? It's not managing setting up a CME program 2 years from now. And so I think that these organizations need to start thinking about the future and starting this conversation. And I just want to thank everybody, and thank you, Curt, thank Mila, and thank my colleagues from the research group for coming today. And I hope that we can find a way of continuing this conversation in the future. And please feel free to contact me at my CME, at my email address, which is there, which is john.parboosingh@gmail.com.
And most important of all, thank you for a fantastic session. It was really thought-provoking. Mila, do you have a closing comment?
Yeah, well, yes, thank you so much, John. This was delightful and truly resonates, I think, with everybody online, and our wheels are turning, I hope. For me, one of the things I thought of is how lucky we are to have an example of a multidirectional learning within the society, and that's the listserv that we tap into, and I think has served us well over many years. The question is, we use it as individuals. Can we think of ways to make it relevant and translate it in our own environments, and how to facilitate maybe that transformation? I thank you very much, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure that we'll have another session with you that will continue this dialogue as it evolves and as we think more about how to give it some traction in our academic centers and wider. I also would like to thank everybody online who, again, gave your precious hours, and I hope you found it valuable. I certainly did. And I do want to remind you all that we will be meeting again here June 20th at 3:30 Eastern Time for another hour. It will be another interesting topic on professional identity formation, and Dr. Barbara Barnes and I will lead that session. And I think we will have Dr. Fred Hafferty from Mayo, whose work we will be looking at, also join the session. So it will be interesting, and we'll have an opportunity to ask him directly what he thinks about some of these concepts. So with that, I thank you all, and I close this session and wish you a very happy Memorial Weekend.